Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Crime of the Century, Richard Speck and the Murders That Shocked a Nation, by Dennis L. Breo and William J. Martin, narrated by Christina Delaine. God, please instill in the hearts of the people the understanding of the meaning of this tragedy. I plead for a purpose, a worth in so disastrous a loss. Why this death? Its reason I do not know, but in the years to come it will show. I trust in this. A poem written by Gloria Jean Davy in 1963, after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, and read at her own funeral in July 1966. Introduction. A scream of terror. The first alarm clock went off at 5 a.m. Corazon Amurao had been huddled under a bunk bed for 2 hours. Now she began to untie herself, working her hands back and forth to loosen the double knots of the bedsheet that bound her. Then she untied her ankles. Another alarm sounded. It was 5:30. Crawling slowly on her stomach, she emerged from her hiding place, and with great effort moved under another bunk bed, from where she could peek out the open door. Nothing moved in the hallway. She stood up and began to walk to her own bedroom. She saw the body of one of her roommates lying on the bathroom floor. As she walked across her own bedroom, she stepped over the bodies of 3 more, covered with blood. She closed her door, fearing the killer might still be in the house. She climbed onto her top bunk, opened the window, and screamed almost continuously for 5 minutes. There was no reply. Dressed in pajama shorts and top, she crawled out the window and jumped down to a ledge of the townhouse facing 100th Street, on the far southeast side of Chicago. She stood there screaming for 20 more minutes before anyone came. A scream that shook terror into the very heart of Chicago. "They are all dead! They are all dead! My friends are all dead! Oh God, I'm the only one alive!" It was July 14th, 1966. And Chicago awoke on that hot and sticky morning to reports that 8 young nurses had been brutally stabbed, strangled, and sexually assaulted. The killings took place as the victims were settling in for the evening in the safety of their own beds. This murder of innocence shocked the conscience of the nation. It seemed that a monster was on the loose, that a crazed killer who walked on 10-foot stilts bestrode a terrified city. Doors were locked, strangers were scrutinized, parents checked on their children. The monster, who was flesh and blood, was little more than a mile due east of the murder scene, toward the lake, in the rough Calumet Harbor area of the southeast side. Richard Franklin Speck, 24, a heavily pockmarked, tattooed drifter from Dallas, was sound asleep in a small upstairs room at the Shipyard Inn, a tavern rooming house catering to seamen and steel workers. A small black pistol was tucked under his pillow. A stale can of beer sat on his nightstand, next to a crumpled pile of dollar bills. What had started out as a $25 robbery had turned into a crime that will never be forgotten. Speck had swept through the nurses' townhouse like a summer tornado, and his savage murders had changed the landscape of crime. Within a few weeks, Charles Whitman would take a rifle to the top of a tower at Texas University and kill 16. Within a few years, Charles Manson would mastermind the helter-skelter killings in Southern California. Speck's legacy to us is the banality of today's mass murders and serial killings. This is how it all began. Part 1. The Murders. Chapter 1. The Chicago thermometer hit 98 degrees on Sunday, July 10, 1966. It was the 11th day in the past 2 weeks that the heat had been 90 degrees or higher, and the city was wilting from the oppressive stickiness. In July 1966, the median annual salary in Chicago was $8,000. Truman Capote's best-selling story of the brutal murder of a Kansas family in their quiet farmhouse, In Cold Blood, could be bought for $5.95 in hardcover. The sporty car of the hour was the gas-guzzling Pontiac GTO designed by John DeLorean and sold for $3,000. The big stories on Sunday were the widening war in Vietnam and the growing race rift in the United States. American soldiers chased Viet Cong units into Cambodia and reportedly killed 238 elite enemy troops. The Reverend Martin Luther King pinned a list of 14 demands for racial equality on the City Hall door of Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley. The action followed a freedom rally that attracted a crowd of 30,000 to Chicago's Soldier Field. King warned that there would be many more marches this summer, and that we'll fill up the jails, if that's what it takes to get black people out of the slums. Meanwhile, Richard Speck was spending a quiet Sunday with his brother-in-law, Eugene Thornton, and his older sister, Martha Speck Thornton. Gene Thornton was a railroad switchman who worked nights and who had once served in the U.S. Navy. Speck's sister Martha was a registered nurse who had worked in pediatrics before her marriage. The Thorntons had 2 teenage daughters and lived on the northwest side of Chicago in an apartment described by neighbors as disgustingly neat. The Thornton home was a second-floor apartment at 3966 North Avondale, in a working-class neighborhood just west of the Kennedy Expressway and not far from Wrigley Field, home of the Chicago Cubs. The apartment was decorated with expensive furniture and Martha Thornton's crystal collection. The small apartment was cramped, and Speck was forced to sleep on his sister's sofa. Speck had been living with the couple on and off since he had boarded a bus for Chicago from Dallas 4 months earlier. Since then, Gene Thornton had tried to satisfy Speck's drifting lifestyle by arranging for him to stay with relatives near Monmouth, Illinois, and by helping him find a commercial ship on which to sail. At 6 feet 1 inch tall and weighing 160 pounds, Speck was a muscular, outdoorsy type who had arms as hard as a baseball bat. He had slicked-back, dirty blonde hair, light blue eyes, and a pale, angular face with a prominent aquiline nose. Some women found him attractive, and he might have passed as moderately handsome were it not for the deep pockmarks that pitted the sides of his face, and his occasional habit of staring stupidly into space with his mouth half open. He often appeared to be in a fog. Speck had spent the weekend moping around his sister's house. Martha Thornton, like Speck's 4 other sisters and 1 brother, was a religious teetotaler, and Speck was not allowed to drink in her house. Able to blend into his surroundings, Speck always conducted himself as a perfect gentleman while staying with the Thorntons. A fastidious man, he indulged his daily habit of taking several showers and going through several changes of shirts. He left the house that weekend only to get a Saturday haircut and to shoot a few games of pool in a nearby saloon. Speck had great dexterity with his strong hands, and he tinkered with his sister's TV set and used his carpentry skills to build her some wooden household furniture. That Sunday, another one of Speck's sisters, Irma Speck Holman, and her husband, Kenneth, brought their son to Chicago to enroll at the Judson Bible College in Elgin, Illinois. The Holmans visited the Thorntons for Sunday dinner, and Speck was on hand, neatly dressed in black pants and a white short-sleeved shirt. He was mild-mannered and quiet, but preferred reading comic books to engaging his family in much conversation. He read with some difficulty, since he needed reading glasses, but he was too vain to wear them. All he offered in conversation was that he had his heart set on buying a new car. He told his two sisters that he was going to ship out to make enough money to buy a new car. Monday morning began with a bang. At 1 a.m., a heavy thunderstorm with tornado-force winds lashed through the Chicago metropolitan area, slashing a wide swath from the northwest to the southeast. The winds reached 80 miles per hour in suburban McHenry, and at 50 miles per hour rattled the windows of the downtown Loop skyscrapers. Savage and vicious bolts of lightning lit up the night sky. Hail the size of marbles pelted the city, and several funnel clouds were sighted, though none touched down. The torrential rains pounding down on Lake Michigan created a seiche, and tidal waves reaching 6 feet crashed against the lakefront, which had to be closed. The temperature dropped from 82 to 71 degrees in the 2 hours between 1 and 3 in the morning. Then, as the storm spent its fury, the sun rose, and the heat began to build toward an eventual high of 93 degrees. The Thorntons' hospitality and patience with Richard Speck were running out. Speck had spent most of the past 2 weeks with them, usually holding court on the back porch and telling tall Texas tales of how tough he was to the teenage suitors of his 2 nieces, Kendra and Tanessa. He kept a large hunting knife hanging in a sheath from his belt. His switchblade was always in his pocket, and he often brought it out to flash the 3-inch blades. Eugene Thornton, a brisk, no-nonsense man, and his bright, animated wife had seen enough of the lazy ways of their young visitor. On Monday morning, Speck was asked to toss his entire wardrobe into a tan vinyl suitcase and a small red and black carrying grip. He had an assortment of polo and sport shirts and wash-and-wear slacks, and his sister had washed and neatly folded all his underwear shorts and T-shirts. Jean Thornton also gave Speck a black corduroy jacket. Speck left behind a souvenir of his stay. On a backyard tree, he had carved the year, 1966, and his initials, R.S. He added a few flourishes, designed to resemble the logo of a gang to which one of his teenage buddies belonged. Promptly at 8 a.m., Martha and Jean Thornton loaded up their car and drove Speck to the National Maritime Union Hall, MNU, a hiring center for merchant seamen. The Union building was located at 2315 East 100th Street, about an hour's drive from where the Thorntons lived. The hiring hall was only a few doors east of 3 nursing residences. Because of a dormitory room shortage, nearby South Chicago Community Hospital had rented 3 small, box-like 2-story townhouses at 2311, 2315, and 2319 East 100th Street for its senior nursing students and for a few Filipino exchange nurses. The 3 townhouses rented by the hospital were part of a row of 6 townhouses fronting on the south side of East 100th Street. The other 3 were private residences, scattered between the nurses' quarters. In the middle townhouse, at 2315, the hospital had placed a house mother, to whom the nurses were required to report. The easternmost townhouse, 2319, was directly west across Crandon Avenue from the Union Hall, and the comings and goings of the ladies in white were a common sight to the seamen. The previous Friday, Thornton had taken Speck to the NMU to obtain a seaman's card and to register him for a berth on a ship. For a few moments, Speck and Thornton had gotten their hopes up that Speck would be able to hire out on the Flying Spray, a cargo ship scheduled to sail to Vietnam. But the coveted berth had gone to a seaman with greater seniority. Speck was only a deckhand with temporary sailing papers. Now, Speck was back to renew his search for a job. He was embarrassed, though, to have to go into the hall carrying all his clothes in the 2 bags, and he pleaded with his brother-in-law to help him find a room. Thornton, however, was adamant, insisting that they try the NMU first. The 2 entered the building together, and learned that 2 ships were listed on the hiring board. Thornton assured Speck that he would be able to hire out on one of them. Speck cajoled, "Well, if I don't ship out today, I'll just sleep on the beach." Thornton gave Speck $25 and left him on his own. Alone, Speck was a gathering storm ready to break. Unknown to the Thorntons, he was on the run from police in 2 states. Speck was the bad apple of a good family. His father died when he was only 6, and Richard spent his formative years with a hard-drinking, hell-raising stepfather whose behavior he chose to mimic. While his 6 older siblings put down family roots near Monmouth, Illinois, the town 215 miles southwest of Chicago where Richard Speck was born, Richard and his younger sister, Carolyn, were shuttled off to Dallas to live with his mother and her new husband. In 12 years, the nomadic family would live in 10 different Dallas addresses, all of them in poor neighborhoods. Speck's stepfather, Carl August Rudolf Lindbergh, was a Swedish traveling salesman and professional drunk who had lost his left leg at the knee in an accident and was forced to walk on crutches. His drunken tirades were in stark contrast to Speck's mother, the religious Mary Margaret Carbaugh Speck, who did not drink, and who had raised her older children not to drink. Lindbergh despised young Richard, told him often that he couldn't stand the sight of him, and refused to adopt him. Speck's mother was largely unsuccessful in trying to shelter her youngest son from Lindbergh's drunken physical abuse. Richard took his first drink of whiskey at 13, after breaking into the secret liquor cabinet Lindbergh kept hidden from his wife. On many occasions, he threatened to take Lindbergh's crutches and bash his head. Aping his hated stepfather, Richard dropped out of school at 16 to work at various odd manual jobs. During his youth, he ran with a fast crowd of older men, spending most of his time bragging, drinking, lying, and whoring. Along the way, he acquired a variety of cheap tattoos, usually drawn while he was dead drunk. During his Dallas days, he was arrested 41 times for break-ins, burglaries, forged checks, robberies, and violence against women, spending almost 2 years in the penitentiary and many other nights in local jails. In the meantime, he had married at 19, fathered a daughter, and divorced 4 years later. He had been physically violent toward both his ex-wife and his ex-mother-in-law. His probation officer had once described him this way: "When Speck is drinking, he will fight or threaten anybody, as long as he has a knife or gun. When he's sober or unarmed, he couldn't face down a mouse." Although a young man, Richard Speck was, by July 1966, a total loner who usually sought out a twilight world inhabited by older, hard-drinking men and women who, like him, were aimless and ambitionless. He was mad at the world and always looking for a chance to hit back. The Thornton Chicago home was a temporary sanctuary for him, a place in which the police were not yet chasing him. In Dallas, the police were looking for Speck in connection with the burglary of a grocery store he had broken into on March 6th. If caught, this would be Speck's 42nd arrest in his adopted home state, and would send him back to prison. The warrant for his arrest had forced him to pack all his worldly belongings into the large tan suitcase and the small red and black bag and board a bus for Chicago. His mother and his younger sister, his only protectors, had taken him to the bus station. They would no longer be around to take care of him, give him money, and bail him out of trouble. A return to his boyhood home of Monmouth was also out of the question, since Speck was a leading suspect in both the burglary rape of an elderly woman and the murder of a 32-year-old barmaid whose body was found in an abandoned hog house. Both crimes had been committed in April, and Speck had slipped out of town on April 19th, arriving back at the Thorntons' Chicago home with the wildly fabricated story that a crime syndicate had forced him out of town. Lying was a Speck's specialty. He had an uncanny ability to give the events of his life a fictional twist that would keep him out of danger, and although his formal IQ tested at only 90, which is barely low normal for an American adult, his criminal skills were much more highly developed. He had the natural gifts of animal cunning and charm. Speck's secret weapons were his gentle eyes and soft-spoken southern drawl, a disarming combination that usually put his male rivals at ease and his female victims off guard. When he walked into that Chicago hiring hall on July 11, 1966, Speck had a growing hatred in his heart from his dismal status in life. Broke, friendless, homeless, and jobless, he was self-conscious about his disfiguring acne and suffering from low self-esteem. A loser in the major tests of maturity, failing to complete an education, find a job, and maintain a marriage, he was now separated from his family in Texas, Monmouth, and Chicago. Worse, he despaired of ever improving his prospects. He was also a potential killing machine, with his trademarks already written into the criminal ledgers of 2 states. He was an expert at breaking and entering, usually with the aid of a screwdriver or the sharp edge of a knife, and he always had one or the other with him. He had threatened women with knives before, often attempting or completing a rape, and he usually spoke gently and softly, assuring the women he meant no harm. Chapter 2. Boredom ruled at the National Maritime Union, as the seamen whiled away the hours in the cavernous warehouse building, waiting for a ship. The commercial shipping center of Chicago was only 2 miles east, at Calumet Harbor in Lake Michigan. In 1966, the Calumet Harbor area boasted many steel mills and shipping and repair docks. Times were good, and the area was a melting pot of nationalities. Factory time clocks were often explained in 11 different foreign languages. The ethnic enclaves were noted for their wide-open saloons and non-stop, around-the-clock heavy drinkers. When the workers or their families needed medical care, they were usually referred to South Chicago Community Hospital, which was located 1 mile north of the Union Hall. Richard Speck had been in this neighborhood before. In April, after his flight from Monmouth to the Thorntons, Speck had been driven by Gene Thornton to the Chicago headquarters of the U.S. Coast Guard in the heart of the Calumet Harbor area. In order to apply, he was required to be fingerprinted on all 10 fingers and to provide a 2-inch by 2-inch passport photo, which he obtained at a photography studio around the corner. In addition, Speck had supplied a statement from a physician under contract to the Coast Guard, documenting that he was physically competent to perform his shipboard duties. Once his application had been accepted, Speck was given a letter of authority, allowing him to be employed as an ordinary seaman on any U.S. merchant vessel weighing 100 tons or more, and engaged in trade on the Great Lakes. His application carried the name Richard Benjamin Speck, his birth name, although he usually preferred to be known as Richard Franklin Speck. Both middle names came from his late father, Benjamin Franklin Speck. Armed with the application, Speck was driven to the National Maritime Union on April 30th and found a ship right off the bat. He signed on as a deckhand with temporary papers aboard Inland Steel's ore-carrying ship, the SS Clarence B. Randall. The Randall sailed the Great Lakes with a crew of 33, picking up ore to return to Inland Steel in Calumet Harbor. Ports of call included stopovers in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Canada. Within 4 days of his enlistment, however, Speck had suffered an acute attack of appendicitis and had been taken by the Coast Guard to a hospital in Hancock, Michigan, for an emergency appendectomy. Once recovered, he had rejoined the Randall on May 20th and worked steadily until the night of June 14th, when he was fired for getting into fights when drunk and for assaulting a ship's officer. His 26 days of continuous employment with Inland Steel were the longest he had worked in a year. His discharge papers were short and sweet. Steady drinker, warned on 2 occasions but continues drinking. When drunk, is looking for trouble. After his firing, Speck had spent a week living in a fleabag hotel in the seamy Calumet Harbor world before returning to the Thorntons. The men and women inhabiting the bars and transient rooming houses of the Calumet Harbor area in 1966 constituted a demimonde, a shadowy world in which ambition and time had little meaning. Most were blue-collar workers or unskilled laborers who slid seamlessly from flophouse to flophouse, bar to bar, drink to drink, and sexual partner to sexual partner. Usually they were either looking for work, about to begin a new job, or freshly fired from an old job. They made just enough money to finance the next drinking bout, and in their own way they hung together. Speck felt completely at home. He took a room at the St. Elmo, named in honor of the patron saint of seamen. It was a southeast side version of Chicago's fabled Skid Row flophouses. The downstairs bar, Pete's Tap, was a dirty hillbilly dive where police were called to regularly break up fights. This joint reeked of stale beer and cloudy cigarette smoke that hung permanently in the air. It was Speck's favorite hangout. Now, he was back on the southeast side, again looking for a ship. Speck spent the morning of July 11th at the Union Hall playing cards with other seamen. Bored sitting around, Speck inquired about a room for the night and was directed to Pauline's, a rooming house located a few blocks away. It was operated exclusively for sailors by a kindly, soft-spoken Croatian. The Croatians ran many of the working-class bars, restaurants, and rooming houses in this tough shipping and steel neighborhood. Speck visited Pauline's twice that afternoon. The first time he was told that no room was available, but he was allowed to leave his 2 bags and check back later. He was also granted permission to use the washroom, where he changed from a black polo shirt to a white one. Then he adjourned to a nearby bar, the Rafter Lounge, where he told bartender Michael Jervis that he was from Dallas and had to catch a boat at 2:30 p.m. It was already 1:30 p.m., and shortly later Speck announced, "Fuck it, I'm not going." He continued to drink until he returned to Pauline's at 3:30 p.m. "I got bad news for you," Pauline told him. "There's no vacancy. Nobody shipped." Speck called upon his manipulative skills. Pauline's retarded son was in the room when she gave Speck the bad news. Ignoring what Pauline had told him, Speck engaged her in a conversation about her son. He took an empty cigarette pack and placed it in the boy's hand. When the boy threw it, Speck picked it up and returned it to the boy. A game was in progress, and Speck was friendly and sympathetic to the retarded boy. He spoke in a low, soft voice. Pauline relented and told Speck he could sleep in the enclosed front porch. Speck promptly changed into a striped shirt and headed off to Ann's Tavern in the neighborhood. Bartender Mary Krinkovic noticed that Speck had a knife in a leather sheath hanging from the left side of his belt. He was freshly shaven, perfectly sober, and talked real nice. When Speck returned to Pauline's for the 3rd time that afternoon, he learned that someone had now shipped out, and he could have the man's room. This inspired him to hit the southeast side taverns, including his old hangout, Pete's. Drunkenly weaving his way back to the rooming house at 12:30 a.m., Speck waved to one of the seamen he knew on the front porch, complaining, "Damn, there's no action and no girls around here." Then he went to bed. Tuesday, July 12th, was a scorcher, reaching a high of 100 degrees. On the city's near west side, a young black boy opened a fire hydrant to get some relief from the heat, and a crowd gathered. The police soon arrived on the scene to close the hydrant and disperse the crowd. A melee ensued, and 10 people were hurt, including 1 police officer. There were 24 arrests. Commenting on the incident, Dr. King announced, "This is the beginning of a long, hot summer." On the international front, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara told a press conference that he anticipated more U.S. air and ground forces would soon be needed in Vietnam. In Europe, Brigitte Bardot married German playboy Gunter Sachs. In Hollywood, Frank Sinatra announced that he was engaged to Mia Farrow, who was 30 years his junior.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?